Welcome to the Property Corner with myself, Rowan Alexander. On this episode, we're going to be looking at whether buy-to-let properties are still a good idea. So back in 2019, I wrote an article that was titled, "Is Buy-to-Let Property Investment on Its Deathbed?" And at the time, a lot of writers were actually coming out with pretty damning reports and ideas that property ownership and the buy-to-let market was something to be avoided at all costs. And very often it was compared to like share ownership in the JSE or different ventures. And there's one big thing that I think people were missing, or that these commentators generally miss when comparing property investment to any other form of investment. And that's the ability to use gearing, whereby you can lend money to gear and thereby exponentially increase your return. If you wanted to invest into a Bitcoin, a share, a foreign exchange, any of those forms, you either need the cash or you need to go and make a personal loan or take it from your credit card. Those come at very short repayment periods at exceptionally high interest rates. Whereas with the property, you have the ability to purchase the property over a 20-year repayment or even a 30-year repayment term. And by putting in an initial deposit or by paying a shortfall, you're able to gear your return. I'll give you a typical example. In today's time, about 2/3 of your bond installment will be covered by your rental. That's the sort of general rule across our market at the moment. So if your bond installment is about 10,000 Rand a month, if you were to rent that property out, you'd probably get in the region of about 6,500 Rand a month. Now, bearing in mind, this is based on this full selling price at this point in time being financed. So a million Rand property would probably rent out for about 6,500 Rand at this point in time. So gearing in its simplest form is like having 100 Rand, in your savings account, but you're getting interest on, say, 400 Rand. How do I get to that calculation? Let me show you or explain to you what I'm trying to say. If I was to buy a property of 1,000,000 Rand and I wanted the property to cover the rental, to cover the bond from day one, I'd probably be having to put in about 40%, 40 to 50%, depending upon the property, up front at this point in time, with the high interest rates and where property prices are at the moment. So I'd need to put in about 400,000 to 500,000 Rand of my own capital. On that money, however, every year I'd be getting growth on the full 1,000,000 Rand purchase price. So my 500,000 Rand would cover the first half of the purchase price, and the other 500,000 Rand would be in the form of a bond, which the tenant is then repaying. But I'm getting capital growth on the full 1,000,000 Rand. So I've effectively doubled my interest earning capacity. And that in its simplest form is the concept and idea behind gearing. There's many ways in which these can be maximized even better, and I'll show you and maybe touch on them a little bit later. But just want to review. In 2019, I wrote this article that I'm referring to, is buy-to-let property investment on its deathbed, and this article got exceptionally good coverage at that point in time. Multiple radio stations. We had discussions with the guys from 702 Upcountry, Cape Talk down in Cape Town, and a number of media houses actually ran this article, and we just discussed it quite extensively. Because I think what people tend to do when looking at property and analyzing property investment is they look simply at the rental income versus purchase price as a method of return measurement, as you would interest on money in the bank, or dividends on shares, and that's right, and that is one element, that yield, that that return on your investment on a monthly basis is one aspect of that property ownership, that investment. But there's ways in which we've said, like gearing, that would actually exponentially change those sums. And the capital growth is the thing that is the kicker. As long as your property market keeps growing in value, which it should be doing if you're purchasing in the right areas and making the right type of property investments. Look, like any investment in life, you can buy good and bad properties. You can buy good and bad stocks. You can buy good and bad or bad currencies. I'm not saying that as a blanket rule, every single property is a perfect investment. It's not. You also need to do your homework and make sure that you're buying the right sort of property in the right sort of area where there is a demand and there is capital growth. Then you're able to unlock far more return, far more growth, or much greater return on your investment. Remember that all markets are cyclical. And at this point in time, as I said, you're probably going to have to put out about 40% to 50% to cover your bond from day one. 10 years ago, when I was doing this in other projects, with as little as 20% deposit, 25% deposit, you could get your property to, break even with the rental income and bond repayment with as little as a 20 to 25% deposit. Those days are gone, though. Rentals haven't stayed abreast or haven't kept up with value escalations. So the shortfall between your monthly installments and your rental income has become far larger. And for this reason, you need to put in a bigger deposit. Not very many people, who are looking at investment property have the ability to put that amount of deposit down over and above your costs. And also, the more cash you put in, the more onerous that return requirement becomes to actually show a good yield. So you want to be putting in as little as possible cash. And over time, we've adapted strategies, and I've worked with a number of clients where we've actually re-looked at that model of trying to get the property to cover its cost from day one. The cash requirement simply becomes too large. So what we like doing at this point in time is to say, yes, the rental market, sort of is on a recovery stream in the sense that rental values are starting to pick up again. But if you look at solely at the ratio of rental income versus bond, you may think that the buy-to-let property market is on its deathbed. But property values are still escalating in good areas, the right type of properties. Property values are still escalating. And the reason for that is largely due to the replacement cost. If you look at new developments, the input costs in the form of materials, labor, indirect costs like fuel, things like that, that constantly drives, that inflationary drives the replacement cost of the property. And that drags your second-hand market along with it. So if you go and look at in old areas where there's been very little new development or redevelopment, you'll typically find that those areas have lower or more stagnant growth trajectories than new areas where you have continuous development, because that replacement cost is not being driven as hard. So that's one of the things in one of the areas that you can then target specifically is you can start looking at a buy-to-let property in a new development, in a new area, where there's a whole bunch of other benefits like less life cycle costs, possible savings on transfer costs, less maintenance costs, warranties from the developers. There's a whole bunch of other benefits, but that's one of the strategies that you can realign to now to ensure that that buy-to-let opportunity still remains, is looking at new properties. And then financially, rather than trying to get it to break even from day one, take the equivalent of 20 or 25% that we were doing 10 years ago and actually put that in a separate account. And you then run the debit order off that account, and you let your rental income come into that account. So to give you an example, if you've bought that property that we referred to for R1 million, and you're getting rental income, let's say, net rental income of 5,000 Rand a month after your costs have been serviced, you're probably going to have about a 5,000 Rand a month shortfall. Now, if you've between what your actual costs are and your rental income, now if you've taken 25% of that purchase price and you've invested that in an interest-bearing account, you've invested 250,000 Rand, set that aside. Rather than putting it into your bond, you've opted for a 100% bond and you've put this 250,000 Rand in a separate account. That would give you the ability to pay that 5,000 Rand a month shortfall every month, up until the point in time that 250,000 Rand is actually depleted. If there's no rental escalation over that period in time, and your costs stay there. So if everything stays the same, your costs stay the same, your income stays the same, you're in a straight line, you will be able to hold on to that property for about 4 years. If that property at a million Rand has grown at 5 or 6% per annum, let's say at 5% per annum, it's escalating at about 50,000 Rand a year. So 4 years later, it's worth 1.2 million Rand, and you have invested 250,000 Rand up front. Remember, your bond would have also, sort of depleted, or your bond would have also gone down at that point in time. So what that allows you to do is to unlock that growth by paying that monthly shortfall. In reality, your rental incomes are typically going to go up, and your rental income is typically going to go up, and your expenses will also go up. But your rental income, because it's such a large component when compared to things like levies and your rates accounts and things like that, that gap of that 5,000 Rand shortfall over time will become less and less and less. Now, if you do that sum over 4 years, it doesn't really make things that attractive, because your capital growth hasn't been, over 4 years hasn't been, such a huge amount when compared to what you've actually invested. You may have turned your 250,000 Rand into 375, and earned 50% on your money. Sure, you can do that in other ways or means, but the longer you hold on to that, and that shorter or the smaller the variance becomes, or that shortfall becomes over time, you're going to find that 250,000 Rand would probably take you to about 5 or 5.5 years. In some instances, that 25%, I've seen that it actually takes you up to 7 years. And when property growth is strong, property value growth is strong, you find that after 7 years, the properties are typically doubling in value. So if you've taken 250,000 Rand on that million Rand property, and you've had to reinvest another 100,000 along the way, you've maybe invested 350,000. But after a 7-year period, that property could be worth 1.7 million Rand, 1.8 million Rand. That's the sort of figures that we've been seeing in the markets lately. Then that 350,000 Rand that you've invested has doubled within a 7-year period. Now, there's very few other opportunities where that could actually be done. And I think that's the true value of gearing in the property market, even in a subdued market where growth rates are low and shortfalls between rental income and monthly expenses are quite big. Imagine we do these sums in the same sort of circumstances that we were pre-COVID, where rental income was about 75% of your bond installment, and those shortfalls are less. You'll see how quickly these same sums look completely different. And that's why I'd encourage you that even in a subdued market, to try and get in now. If you're able to purchase a buy-to-let property at this point in time, and make those sums work now, you're going to be part of the upward turn. Markets are cyclical. Every single market is cyclical. You're going to have your highs, you're going to have your lows. That's a given. And at this point in time, given where the interest rates are, where property values are, we are at the bottom of the value cycle, the pricing cycle. There's going to be an upward turn at some point in time in the future. And if you don't own investment property at that point in time, you're not going to be able to capitalize on that, or you're going to be buying in at a higher value, a higher price at a later point in time. So, now some tips that I could give from buying to let, how you would approach that now. You want to be applying for a 100% bond so that you can put as little as possible cash into that investment. If you do that, you'll be able to retain more cash to subsidize the shortfalls and get you further along in time. So if we do that same sum, the R1,000,000 property, putting 250,000 Rand, if you finance that in full, every other cent that you have, you could use to maybe extending that 4-year ownership period to maybe 5.5, 6, 7, or in an ideal world up to 8 years. Along with that, I'd recommend taking the longest loan term that you can get. Remember, with this strategy, your intention is never to actually pay the property off. You want to get as much capital growth you can with as little as possible input that you have to put in. And by extending that loan term to 30 years, you'll find that installment will reduce and your shortfall will be less, which will again give you more time. So on that same sum, 250,000, if we increased your loan term to 30 years, you'd probably find that your ownership period could go from 4 years up to 5.5 years. And that makes a big difference because all of a sudden, these investment sums start looking completely different. So my message to you would be that while it's a difficult time to execute these plans, it's a good time. If you have the means, if you have the ability, even if it is in the form of co-ownership, something that I've been doing recently is investing as co-owners into these sort of properties in anticipation of the upward swing and doing things in this way. It's become harder and harder as an individual to come up with the cash requirements that are needed to buy that investment outright. But as doing it as co-owners, we've managed to achieve far more than what we would have if everyone had done that individually. If you want to have more of this sort of advice and maybe get into the details of some of these investments that I have made, and get me to show you those numbers or explain these concepts, sort of in a better way, drop us a comment below and we'll try and unpack that some more for you.